voices for making cities, towns, and neighborhoods work better for both people and the environment. Based in Washington, D.C., he serves as senior counsel at PlaceMakers, LLC, a city and town planning consultancy working across the United States and Canada. Before joining PlaceMakers in 2015, Cade worked for over 30 years as a senior attorney and program director at the Natural Resources Defense Council, where he founded and led the organization's Sustainable Communities program, and before that, managed the litigation of some of the organization's most important legal cases. A prolific public speaker and writer, Cade's large portfolio of publications spans several books and over 1,000 articles for such publications as The Atlantic, HuffPost, City Lab, PlaceShakers, and Newsmakers, and numerous other websites and academic journals. During his tenure at NRDC, Cade was a co-founder of Smart Growth America, excuse me, a leading nonprofit organization and nationwide coalition working on revitalizing cities, building better neighborhoods for all people, and stopping the spread of suburban sprawl. He also co-founded Lead for Neighborhood Development. An avid cyclist, ardent music buff, and enthusiastic sports fan, Cade grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, and holds degrees from Emory University and Georgetown University Law Center. So now I will hand it over to Cade. Thanks again for joining us today. We're really happy to have you.
Thank you so much, Mandy, and thanks everybody. Let me get my screen shared. I am so honored and happy to be with you guys today. What I would like to do in my time with you is to share 6 concepts, or what, as I'm calling them here, 6 principles that I think it would do us well to follow as we move to a more resilient future for both human health and for confronting the challenges of climate change. Now, I'm not going to argue that they're the only 6 things that we need to do. Heaven knows we need to do more than these 6. And for some communities, they may not be the most important 6, but I do think they're important, and I hope you find them provocative and useful. Before I get to the 6 principles, I want to share with you some very big picture data. This is national data and global data that sort of paint a picture of the problems we share as a nation and as communities. And I'm going to start with health. This is the trend in life expectancy since 1980. The green line is life expectancy trend in the United States. The blue line is comparable countries as determined by the Kaiser Family Foundation. And what I think we can conclude from watching the green line is that in general, since 1980, our overall health has been getting better. That's good news. But it has not been getting better as much as comparable countries. And the other thing to notice is that since a peak in 2014, life expectancy started going down, and it has gone down for at least 3 straight years. We may be on the 4th straight year of decline in life expectancy. So although our health was getting better, it's maybe not getting so much better now. Here you see a snapshot of the 2017 data. The US, unfortunately, at the bottom, the other 11 countries above us, Japan and Switzerland at the top. I'm going to show you one more health slide. These are all conditions that I think we can influence to some extent or other by the way that we build and shape our communities. And among the things that jump out at me from this list are obesity, of course, hypertension. Almost 1/3 of Americans suffer from unhealthy high blood pressure. And in the 2 mental health categories at the bottom of the list, depression and anxiety, I think it's important to note that those are diagnosed cases. And I think if we were to provide an estimate of all cases, because I think a lot of mental health cases are not diagnosed, those numbers would be quite higher. So we've got health challenges. We also have climate challenges, as we all know. The last 5 years have been the hottest 5 years on record. What jumps out at me from this graph is how steep the incline has been since about 1970, over the last half century. And that corresponds, of course, with a steep incline in global carbon emissions. Now we can expect carbon emissions to go down in 2020 because of slowed economic activity related to the pandemic. But there was a great analysis in the New York Times this week, and analysts expect that decline to be both modest and temporary. And it's also worth noting that just because we're putting carbon into the atmosphere at a slower rate does not mean we're putting less, does not mean that there is less carbon in the atmosphere. As a matter of fact, there is more carbon in the atmosphere today than there has ever been. Here's something we come in first. Among the world's large economies, the U.S. is the largest consumer emitter of greenhouse gases. And as you can see by the chart here, that's by a considerable margin. Among the sectors of our economy that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions from the U.S., transportation has for some time been the fastest growing, and it is now the largest. I highlight it here because I think transportation is a category that we can influence with the way that we build and shape our communities. One of the reasons transportation has been growing so fast is because we've been driving more and more. What this graph is telling us is that we have tripled the amount of driving that we Americans do in the last 5 decades. During that same time period, we've grown in population about 60%. So you can say that we have grown traffic 5 times faster than we've grown population in the last half century. Another thing to notice from this graph are these gray periods. Those are periods of recession. And during each one, including the one we had about a dozen years ago, traffic has declined as a result of the economic slump. But then there has been a period of recovery after which it goes right back up. Now notice that this graph ends, the data in this graph in February 2020, which happens to be precisely before the pandemic hit. Driving has gone down with the pandemic and slowed economic activity as a result, but it's already rebounding. And I think that although recovery may take a long time, my guess is that it will eventually tick back up again. One of the reasons that driving in the United States has grown so much is because of the way that we have developed. In the 17-year period from 2001 to 2017, we converted 24 million acres of natural land to some form of development in the lower 48 states. And that doesn't even include a lot of farmland because of the way that that study measured natural land. For the last two decades, for which the American Farmland Trust has data, we converted 31 million acres of agricultural land. 24 million acres is a chunk of land about the size of Indiana, and 31 million acres is a chunk of land about the size of Mississippi. And I thank the Maine Farmland Trust for that great photograph of some very pretty Maine farmland. All of this has consequences, as we all know. We're feeling the consequences now. I participated in a different conference last week, and I was in a session where one of the presenters offered a predictive map of which parts of the country could expect to see which changes as a result of climate change over the coming decades. For Maine, three things stood out to me. One is significantly higher precipitation. Two, more flooding. Three, sea level rise. So those are the background data. Let me get to my 6 principles. And the first one is to celebrate and invest in walkable neighborhoods. Now, chances are if you're participating in Build Maine, you already believe in this. But let me give you some information that will help support your argument and mine on the point. This is a survey of 17 nations that was published on the website of National Geographic. We Americans come in absolutely last in the amount of walking that we do. The Canadians, even with colder weather than most of America, not sure about Maine, walk significantly more than Americans do. The Brits walk about twice as much as we do, and the Germans and Brazilians walk even more than that. But why would we expect Americans to walk when we have been giving ourselves environments in which walking is so unsafe and inconvenient? The only people who walk in a place like this are people without better choices. What I find so disconcerting about this photograph is not just that the poor woman can't get across the street, but that it looks like so much of America. We used to walk more. Half a century ago, about half of our kids walked to school. And my guess is that a lot of us participating in the session this morning when we were kids walked or rode a bike to school. 40 years later, that number was down to 13%, and I wouldn't be surprised if that number is a little bit lower today than it was in 2009. But again, why would we expect people to walk to school when we've been building schools that are not walkable? This is a high school in Northern Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. Its campus is twice as big as Disneyland. Its parking lots take up more space than the classrooms, and there is nothing remotely close enough to walk to or from. And I'm afraid remotely is a good word, even if someone were so inclined. Now, I'm not going to blame our lack of walking entirely for the epidemic of obesity that we are experiencing in this country, but it is part of the reason. We've gone in a generation from a country in which almost no state had an obesity rate of even 15% to a country in which every state is over 20%. The vast majority, including Maine, are over 25%, and quite a few are over 30%. And if we look just at adult Americans, about 40% of us can now be considered obese. As we've gained in obesity, we've gained in weight-related disease. Here's a decade's worth of data showing how closely weight gain tracks with increased incidence of diabetes. So what do we do? Interestingly, the research teaches us that the most significant indicator of how much walking takes place from a given neighborhood is how well connected the streets are. And in this classic side-by-side diagram, you can see why. When streets are well connected, travel routes become shorter and walking becomes a more feasible and attractive option. So where we have neighborhoods with well-connected streets, we need to make sure they're properly invested. And when we build new neighborhoods, we need to make sure that we build them with well-connected streets. We also need good infrastructure for walking, especially sidewalks. We need vehicle traffic to move at appropriate speeds. And importantly, we need things to walk to within convenient walking distance of our homes and workplaces. Chris and Bernice talked last week about form-based codes. Form-based codes allow us to do this and to put things within walking distance of our homes and workplaces. The research also shows us that when these ingredients are present in a walkable neighborhood, that residents of that neighborhood, on average, will have lower blood pressure, lower incidence of hypertension, and even way less than residents of an unwalkable neighborhood, weigh 6 to 10 pounds less, even if we tease out other relevant factors such as age, ethnicity, and income. So that's point one, walkable neighborhoods. Point two is something that I don't think we talk about enough in conferences like this, and it's dear to my heart. Provide an abundance of accessible nature. I like to say that nature is a wonder drug. Nature in cities, towns, and neighborhoods heals the environment at the same time that it heals people. And I'm going to tick off some of the particulars. For climate resilience, nature absorbs carbon dioxide and other pollutants from the atmosphere. It absorbs stormwater and other precipitation before it becomes runoff. It helps moderate temperatures, reducing energy consumption and associated carbon emissions. And for human health, community nature is associated in the scientific literature, and I'm just going to read these from a list: reduced hypertension, improved heart and lung function, improved cognitive function. For students, improved academic performance, improved mood, reduced incidence of depression and anxiety, and even improved longevity for people with nature near their homes. So let's talk about some of the ways in which we can bring nature into walkable communities. And I'm going to start with small parks. Big parks have their value, but I am especially fond of small parks that can be sprinkled around our communities. This is Savannah. It's one of Savannah's famous green squares. This one is called Chippewa Square. And as you can see, it is quite lovely and being enjoyed. And when you look at where it is located, what I really like is that it is reachable on foot from all of this surrounding community fabric. Here's a suburban city park. This is Elm Street Park in Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside of DC, where I live. It's only 1.5 acres in size. It too is quite lovely, as you can see. And when you look at where Elm Street Park is situated, you see to the east, there is a walkable neighborhood of single-family homes. And to the west, there is a busy commercial corridor. That is a street called Wisconsin Avenue. That is the main drag of Bethesda, Maryland. Elm Street Park draws from both sides and acts as a buffer between those two very different kinds of land use. Let's go smaller still. This is Elmhurst Park. Elmhurst Park is in Boston in a neighborhood called Codman Square. It's only 1/2 acre, and it has a great history. There were 2 adjacent vacant lots, and the neighbors lobbied the city to convert them into a children's park, and eventually they succeeded. I had the honor of doing some work there several years ago, and I was impressed by how the kids had hand painted these signs and placed them around the perimeter. But there are other ways of bringing nature into our communities as well. Chris mentioned green streets last week. I'm a huge fan of green streets and green infrastructure because if we are thoughtful about the way we landscape our streets, we can do so that they absorb stormwater and other precipitation before it becomes polluted runoff and contaminates downstream waterways at the same time that it beautifies the neighborhood. This example is in Hartford, by the way. And here's my favorite slide in the whole presentation. Trees have special benefits for communities. And there's all sorts of research on this. I'm just going to cite one piece of it. If you add 10 trees to a city block or a town block, it has the same effect on residents' mood as a $10,000 annual increase in income or being 7 years younger. Those are two reasons why I am so glad this particular corridor of streets is right around the corner from my house. We can have green buildings that are green on the outside as well as in. This one is in Japan. This, of course, is a big city building. It's somewhat extravagant. But we can also do this sort of thing much more modestly. Look at this green roof on a garage. This is in Victoria, BC. Community gardens and urban farms are another way of bringing nature into our communities. And for denser areas like downtown, I really love courtyards. This one happens to be in Germany, but I could easily see it in some downtowns in Maine. I could see it in DC. I could see it in so many places. And I'm going to close this section with what I call a money quote from the research. This was a huge study with a database of over 8 million subjects in 7 countries. And the takeaway was that the more green space there is within 500 meters from one's home, that's between a 5 and 10 minute walk, the longer one is likely to live. Notice how on the bottom left of the slide, I have highlighted codescore.org. CodeScore is a website that was developed by my firm, PlaceMakers, that so far contains 135 pieces of research, their findings, citations, and links to the original studies. So basically all of the studies that I've been citing as we've been going along can be found in CodeScore. And this brings me to point 3. Point 3 is huge for climate resilience. Be thoughtful about where to build. Or as I sometimes like to put it, even the greenest development, if it's in the wrong place, is it going to have good green performance? The reason for that is that the green performance of a building or development isn't determined just by the characteristics of that building or development, but consists also of the traffic that that building or development generates. And what this chart is telling us is that in most cases, it's the traffic that has the bigger impact. We use more energy and thus emit more carbon getting to and from an average office building than the office building itself uses and emits. But where it gets interesting is that transportation doesn't always overwhelm building energy because it depends on where we locate the building or development. And I'm going to illustrate that by reference to this beautiful small city, a little bit bigger than Portland, but not much bigger. This is the place in Western North Carolina where I was lucky enough to grow up. This is Asheville, North Carolina. I was pleased that Mike Lydon, in his presentation at Build Maine, highlighted some of the work that he's done in Asheville. And I'm going to lead off with this pretty picture of Asheville because the next several slides are seriously wonky. And I thought I would seduce you with some beauty before we get into another view of Asheville. This is a carbon map of Asheville. And what it is showing you is areas in Asheville and its surroundings in Buncombe County, North Carolina, that are high carbon, low carbon, and intermediate carbon for transportation. What I mean by that is that the dark areas are places where, on average, households emit relatively high levels of carbon for transportation. The light-colored areas are areas where households, on average, emit relatively low levels of carbon for transportation. Notice how the low carbon areas, the light colored areas, are concentrated in and around the center of the region. That's because on average, households in and around the center of the region drive less than do households on the fringe. Now, interestingly, they may drive just as often. In fact, in Asheville, which is a place where pretty much everybody drives pretty much everywhere, my guess is that they drive exactly as often as households on the fringe. But when they do, they don't drive as far. And the reason for that is that central locations, on average, tend to shorten driving distance. And it makes a big difference. The lowest carbon areas emit a little over 6 tons per year of CO2. The outermost locations emit over 10 tons per year of CO2. And what this means for development is that to the extent that we can locate our investments in and around these low carbon and intermediate carbon areas and avoid placing it on the fringe, we will be reducing our carbon footprint, reducing our carbon emissions. I was really pleased in the developers talk before we started our session this morning to see that new redevelopment in Burdick. Its location looks ideal to me. I've looked at 75 maps of cities, towns, and metro regions from across the country, and they all follow this same pattern of the lowest carbon areas being close to the center, and the farther out you go, the more likely you are to be in a high carbon area. This is what a carbon map of Portland looks like. This is Lewiston. Here's Bangor. And here's another money quote. So this is another really big study that looked at data from 37 peer-reviewed studies, aggregated and analyzed the data, and found that if you cut the distance between development and the town center in half, you can reduce per capita driving and thus associated emissions as much as 32%. So reinvestment and building close to town is definitely the way to go to be resilient to climate change. And that brings me to point 4. embrace density. My favorite kind of density is human scale density that I think would fit well into Maine. And let me talk a little bit about the benefits of density. Here you see all the things that density is associated in the literature with in terms of benefits. I'm going to focus on two: lower CO2 emissions and reduced stormwater runoff per unit of development. Here is a classic graph, if you're in the environmental world, that plots household density against household driving rates. We're going left to right, very low densities to very high densities. And then the vertical axis is vehicle miles traveled per household per year. Notice at very low densities, driving rates are very, very high. As we add density at each point along the line, driving rates go down. The same is true of stormwater development per unit. The reason for that is that low density development requires more impervious surface in the form of roadways and parking lots to service it than does more compact development. So again, as we add density, we're putting less pavement overall into the watershed, and as a result, runoff volume per unit goes down. But this begs the question of how much density do we need in order to get benefits? This is a very unappealing photo of an otherwise pretty appealing city. This is Toronto. Here's the same graph we were looking at before, but this time with two data points marked: 9 homes per acre and 53 homes per acre. Notice how at 9 homes per acre, where we can still have single family homes, we are already halfway to the maximum potential that we can achieve in reducing driving rates. By the time we get to 50-something homes per acre, we're 90% to the maximum we can achieve in potential reduction in driving rates. Here's an example of what 9 homes per acre can look like. That is an infill development in Seattle. The lots are small, but they're placed around a common green, so the feel is one of verdant spaciousness. 53 homes per acre. This is a neighborhood that I'm sure a lot of you New Englanders would recognize. This is the historic neighborhood of Beacon Hill in Boston. And I'm going to show you 2 developments that I think would fit in well into Maine that are also at human scale densities. This is 12 homes per acre. It's a place called 3rd Street Cottages. It's in Washington State. And as the name cottage applies, these are in fact very small units. I think the largest one is maybe 900 and some square feet. Being a city boy, I tend to think of that as actually a pretty large apartment. So it's apartment-sized living for people who don't want to live in an apartment building, but would rather live in a home. These small homes are placed around a common green. As Sharon Woods explained to us in her presentation, there is a market for small-sized living. And I think they're just utterly gorgeous. Here's the way they are placed around their site. And here's where they're located in the community. Langley only has a population, a full-time population of about 1,000 people, but it's big enough to have a small Main Street area with a pub and a restaurant and some shops and services. 5-minute walk from 3rd Street Cottages to the main drag of Langley. And let me show you another development. This is an abandoned automobile dealership. It happens to be in suburban Atlanta, but we have abandoned automobile dealerships and abandoned big box stores in all sorts of communities all across the country. And here's the conceptual plan for what that site can look like. It's got a little bit of everything: mixed-use buildings, some adaptive reuse of the older building, some housing. I absolutely love this. For those of you who are involved in the Incremental Development Alliance, this is Eleanor and John Anderson's project. I'm sure some of you know Eleanor and John in East Point, Georgia. And this brings me to point 5. We need to get the buildings right too. So promote green and healthy buildings. And I'm going to start with older buildings, because I think older buildings have very special properties for our community as we look at a couple of nice ones from Belfast. I think we've all had the experience of going by a recent demolition and finding it unsettling and disorienting. It's hard to get our bearings. But when we allow our communities to evolve gradually and incrementally, and when we take care of our older buildings that give our places character, it has the opposite effect. It's calming and it's reassuring. I call that continuity of place. Older buildings also have some pretty significant green properties. As we look at the courthouse in, I believe this is Rockland, and the wonderful words of architect Carl Elefante, the greenest building is the one that's already built, because we don't have to expend the environmental resources to build it again. The National Trust also has research showing that when we demolish an older building, even if we replace it with a newer building that has significantly greener standards, it will take us many decades to realize any green benefits from those green standards, because of the substantial cost involved in demolition and construction of the new materials, transportation of the new materials, and construction of the new building. Of course, we can have it both ways. We can have an old building and retrofit it. Here we're looking at a home in Ann Arbor that is from the Victorian era that is now net zero for both energy and water. And here we're looking at a 5-story building. You can't see that from the photograph, but because it's in Washington, I know that it's a 5-story building that's been retrofitted with a green roof. All that said, we are going to be building new buildings. And when we do, I think it's important that we build them to green standards. The Department of Energy has research looking at the buildings in the federal government's portfolio and finding that the buildings built to green standards have all these benefits that you see here, including 34% lower carbon emissions. That is significant when we are responding to to climate change. And of course, if you can meet Passive House standards, I know that Passive House is one of the partners of Build Maine, you can do a lot better than even these numbers. The photograph is my personal favorite green building. That is the Embassy of Finland in Washington. It's LEED Platinum, and it is actually not too far from my house. It's also important that we build buildings to healthy standards. We don't have time to talk about all the things that go into that, but here you can see the list of some of the ingredients. I was looking this morning at the well standard, which is a standard that we can meet for healthy buildings. And I have to say a little bit about this photograph. I didn't take it, but it is showing my dear friend and former colleague, Marissa, enjoying her coffee in front of the green wall in NRDC's Washington office where I used to work. And this brings me to the last point. Sustainability is where the heart is. In some ways, this is the most important point, because if we don't do this, we're not going to realize all of the benefits that we should be realizing from the first 5 points. And Gertrude Stein famously said of Oakland, California, there is no there. Now, it would be unfair to say that about Oakland today, but we all know places that don't have a there. The phrase has stuck with us because we have so many places in the U.S. that don't have anything distinctive about them, that don't have anything special about them, that make us want to care about them. This could be anywhere in the country. It happens to be suburban San Diego. I think that instead we need to very consciously set about to create lovable places. And I know that even though I've given you all these data leading up to this slide, that now lovable is a very mushy word. It does not lend itself very well to data. It's very hard to quantify, very hard to measure. But that does not make it unimportant, because it is the places that we love that will be cared for and sustained over time. It doesn't do any good to have a place that's sustainable if we don't sustain it. So I'm going to leave you with a series of images of places that I think are lovable, that I think have a there, and that I think are worth sustaining. And I'm going to start with your landscape. This wonderful photograph by Jane LaFleur, who I think is in the session today and whom I'm sure many of you know. I believe this farm is on the road between Camden and Rockport. Remember the statistics that I was quoting early on about natural land and farmland that we have lost to development. Maine is blessed with so much wonderful landscape, and it's so important that you don't let that happen to your special places. Let's go to a city place. This is a place that's lovable, that has a there, that stood the test of time. This is the Quincy Market area in Boston. Notice how it has some of the things we've been talking about. It has nature, it has walkability, it has history, it has buildings of different sizes and ages working together, and it's being loved in the photograph. But you don't have to go to a big city to find these kinds of special places that are lovable and that have it there. I visited Bath several years ago, and I was struck by how lovely its front street was. Again, nature, human scale density, walkability. To me, this looks like a place that is loved and a place with a there. Small businesses can contribute greatly to a sense of a there and a sense of lovability. This is the ice cream shop in Camden. I go there every time I'm in Camden, which is not as often as I wish. And it's not just because I love ice cream. It's because I think this place is special. I think it is helping to contribute lovability, and a sense of there to its community. Markets are a great way to bring a sense of place into a community. This one is in Salt Spring, British Columbia. And so is culture, especially local culture. This photograph was taken in Franklin, Tennessee, where I imagine they have some pretty darn good local music. And I'm going to finish with another slide of my hometown, Asheville. The City Hall was built in the 1930s. The plaza and fountains were finished about a decade ago. Notice how well the old and new work together. Notice how the place is being loved in the photo. And it gives me a chance to use my favorite phrase, people habitat. I didn't coin it. My friend Trish coined it, but I stole it for a book title. And I'm fond of using it. And it gives me a chance to talk about the indicator species for people habitat. When we study natural habitat, we learn to look to the health of individual species in order to indicate whether an ecosystem as a whole is likely to be healthy. So if we're studying a river, we may look to the health of a particular species of fish, or if we're studying a forest, we may look to the health of a particular species of bird. For people habitat, kids and elders make great indicator species. If kids and elders love a place, if kids and elders are comfortable in a place, chances are we have a lovable place with a there, and we have a place that is likely to be sustained. With that, I thank you so much for your time. Here are some ways in which you can find me, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cade. That was great. We really appreciate you speaking. Before we jump into the Q&A portion of the event, I'd just like to let you know what's going on next week. So next Thursday, you can join us for Chuck Marone. Chuck is the founder and president of Strong Towns and the author of Strong Towns, a bottom-up revolution to rebuild American prosperity. Chuck will address issues of tightening budgets and unfunded infrastructure obligations and the strain it puts on local governments and services. He will explain why we seem to have lost the American edge on prosperity and what we can do to get it back. So please be sure to buy tickets if you have not already. And yes, I'd like to invite everybody to put some there's a lot of comments and they're fantastic, but also questions in the chat box. We are compiling those, and we can start off with. So, yeah, you start off.
I was just going to say that we can go back to the beginning. There's a question when you were talking about climate change impacts in Maine from Jen Curtis, who's in Wyndham. He says, the Maine floodplain program has been steadily defunded for the last decade. It has gone from 7 employees at its peak down to 2. So that's, something you might need to deal with.
That's a sad commentary for a state that is likely to be facing sea level rise over the coming decades. And I know governments at all levels are really strained for budget right now, and certainly the recession that we're in is not going to help that. So I'm sorry to hear that, because we're going to need to respond to that impact as well as many impacts of climate change.
I think it's something that's actively being worked on today, in fact, as the Climate Council is meeting, I think, for the 2nd day. Jeremiah comments that your photo of the school looks like a nice Maine DOE compliant high school.
That's part of the problem is that there are standards put out uh, for school sites and school construction that really prevent them from being built in walkable places. And we really need to work on those standards.
We have a comment from Bernice related to trees and wondering if we can re-tree our vacant lots to encourage small parks over time. It'd be lovely. And there's some more conversation about apple trees and other kinds of trees, maple trees. And I think there's several communities that have done some of that work. I think Lewiston's on the line. I don't know if anyone else has added trees. I think Portland has a street tree program. I'm not sure if
another study I read recently is that tree density matters. There's another kind of density that we can think about. The more trees, the more pronounced the benefits to human health.
Does anyone want to share on the line any programs related to either street tree planting programs or reimagining vacant lots with gardens or trees?
Well, that's something we'd all like to see more of. Well, there was that one example in Boston of vacant lots that was converted into a children's park. And I do think that more of that is needed. I think that we need to get more creative about how to bring nature into our communities in a way that's compatible with walkability and with the kind of densities that support walkability. And, you know, I mentioned a few of the ways, but in general, I don't think there's enough thinking on this subject. You know, if you go to a conference that American Planning Association or the American Institute of Architects or CNU, you never see any sessions on nature. And considering how incredibly important it is both to climate resilience and to human health, I think that is a subject whose time is overdue. I think we need to talk about this. We need to do it.
Mandy mentions Lewiston has a program for residents who are looking to add street trees to their yards or in the right-of-way. It's a tree bait.
I think Misty might mention that, not Mandy.
Oh, sorry. That's what I meant to say. Misty.
Thank you, Misty, for that comment.
And Jane mentions that Maine helps fund trees through the Canopy program, she believes. Liz asked the question, I rarely see public health people talking about zoning. Are there good national models of land use public health collaboration?
I think we've seen more of it than we saw 20 years ago, but we still don't see enough of it. I think that well, actually, 2 weeks ago, I did an interview in a radio program where my counterpart, we were both talking about transportation impacts, and I was talking about transportation impacts on climate, and the other guest was talking about transportation impacts on public health. So we're starting to see a little more intersection between the two fields, and I hope we see more in the future. I would tend to agree that there hasn't been enough in the past.
So Reja has a question which sort of incited a lot of comments. Is there a difference between a tiny home village a dense cottage development, and a trailer park? Is it just flowers and socioeconomics? She wants to recognize that we can, that we have something to learn from our nicer trailer communities in our towns also, and they can have perhaps smugly say they did it first. And then there's a couple of comments that I'll read, and then maybe you can comment, Cade. Liz says, I think the major distinguishing element of a trailer park is a lack of investment due to the land being owned by an outside third party. Cooperative Development Institute has helped 50 trailer parks become resident-owned communities, but supporting residents to cooperatively purchase the land under their homes. Hans says, historically, the quality of construction and design would be expected to differ. And then Addie says, in Vermont, the Lamoille Housing Partnership rebuilt a mobile home park to meet net zero standards, Evergreen in Hardwick. So thoughts on that, Kid?
Well, first, I couldn't agree more that there is historically affordable housing value in mobile homes and manufactured homes. And I think what has been perhaps lacking in that, at least in the ones that I have seen, is the sort of community design element. They tend to be just sort of plots of land with manufactured homes plopped on top of them without much common areas, so you don't see them placed around a common landscaped green or things like that. And I think that they are perhaps worth a little bit more investment. And I think that there's something to learn from that experience. I'm not an expert in it, but I wish I could remember the name of this community. It was in Charlottesville, Virginia, where there really was an effort made to take a trailer park and to take it a few steps along the way to something that, for lack of a better word, we call urbanism. I'm not terribly fond of the word urbanism because community design is relevant to a lot of places that I don't think I would define as urban. But bringing a little more community design and a little more pride, if you will, to the trailer park as a way of living affordably. And I think that's an area worth exploring. I have a class that I haven't taught in a long time, but for several years I taught a class in sustainable communities at George Washington University Law School. And I think that would be a great paper to assign somebody. How can we develop design and maybe even some zoning standards in order to encourage the community aspects of this kind of affordable living.
So just a follow on that question, Bernice asks, what term do you prefer instead of urbanism?
I don't know, walkability, design, the other sorts of terms that I was using. I think urbanists tend to sort of self-congregate and pat ourselves on the back, for being good urbanists. And I think there's a whole range of communities that don't meet the somebody, John Zimmerman, my friend John, hi John, just posted that People Habitat works, plugging my book. So thank you, John, for that. I don't know, Bernice. Let's work on that.
We have a great question here from Jane. Kate, can you talk about retrofitting unloved places and the commitment that that takes?
I think it probably takes the kind of commitment, if this is the Jane I think it is, that you employ in your heart and soul workshops, where you can sort of work on places to make them better. And I also think that the example we saw in the developers talk in Berwick before we began my part of the program, where there was an outmoded factory, industrial type site that was being converted into a mixed use site with placemaking. And then the other thing I would point to is we really need to remake the suburbs into something better. And I think the opportunities for that are going to come in the form of redeveloping commercial sites, such as the example that I showed of the automobile dealership outside of Atlanta. We've got a lot of unloved places in our suburbs, and a lot of work to be done, and some good people have written about that. Of course, Ellen Dunham Jones and June Williamson and Galina Tachieva. I'm always afraid I'm going to mispronounce Galina's name, and my friend David Dixon have all written books about suburban retrofit, suburban remix, and I think that is a fruitful area for converting some unloved places into loved places. I see a pop-up question from Bernice. Do we really want to do that? Do we really want to make our suburbs better? I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think we have, at least for me, it's yes. We have a growing population. We need to bring our emissions down, and I think the suburbs have a role to play in that. They're already built, as someone is saying on a comment here, need to make them connected and their own centers. Absolutely.
So we have a question from Liz who asks, I rarely see public health people talking about zoning. Are there good national models of land use and public health collaboration? And then there's a couple of notes from Robin, also interested in the intersection between land use and public health. And Dora Ann Mills presented last year on the topic of public health and open space and development patterns. I don't believe that it was at Build Maine, but that would be great.
I think I already commented on that.
Already asked that question.
Sorry.
I think it's something, I mean, I agree that it's something that we need to do more of.
That was, Dorian Mills was at Grossmart, Maine, so they probably have that presentation on their website. We can kind of try to track it down.
Excellent.
For people. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions they want to unmute and ask directly.
Carol's asking, has anyone created a performance for developments that gives points for increasing health?
Yes. There is the WELL building standard, which is all about designing healthy buildings at least. So that's a start, and it roughly parallels LEED and the kinds of certifications that it gives, but it's all about health rather than about environment.
Tim comments that we need to reverse the trend of there's still an ongoing conversation about the suburbs and whether to redevelop them. Stop the sprawl, stop funding new highways and roads, and shift that funding to public transport, biking and walking, preserve farmland and what is left of natural space.
On and on. I couldn't agree more.
So Carol has a follow-up question. Health performance standards for the entire development, that includes transportation, walking, nature, building.
That sounds like another good paper I should be giving my students. That's a great subject, and I am not aware that it has been developed to the extent that you are suggesting, and I would tend to agree that it could and should be.
John and Cindy ask, do you have any suggestions on how to adjust density requirements in towns that hold tight to their old standards?
And I assume by that the question is implying that the towns are holding on to low density standards. And you know, it takes a lot of good assumption. I see the comment, good assumption. You know, a lot of hard work, a lot of education. You know, the way that change occurs can be slow and painful. And good examples, you know, I think that one reason I like to show a lot of images in my presentations is I think examples really help people see, well, oh, this is, you know, this is possible. You know, nine homes per acre can look beautiful. We've seen so many bad examples. I mean, there's been so much crappy development built over the last 50 years, and some of that has been dense development. It hasn't all been ugly sprawl. There's been a lot of ugly dense development as well. Need better examples.
Okay, do you have any recommendations on how to keep your spirit up? This is coming from Bernice. I'm struggling to see that well, not sure how to read this one aloud, but that we can unmess up the world right now with so much division. Unscrew up the world. There we go.
Vote in November.
And actually, Maine's primaries are coming right up too, so request your absentee ballot. I believe they're the 14th of July.
I do agree that it is a very dispiriting time in America right now for a lot of reasons, serious reasons, you know, health reasons, reasons of racial division, reasons of political division. I tend to take the long view and be somewhat of an optimist, because I remember when our cities and towns were left for dead several decades ago, and they have come back, and I have seen them come back in some wonderful ways. And, you know, because of that, I tend to take a bit of a optimistic long view. But boy, when I look at the short-term stuff, and I look at some of the serious problems that have been exposed just in the last few months, important problems that needed to be exposed. It's, these are tough times. I agree, but, build something beautiful and lovable in your community. Do the work, Bernice, that you're already doing. And, you can see tangible results in increments, and take, some genuine comfort and pride in that.
Okay, I think I missed a question from Kai. Are there good models for practical ways to partner with local communities and nonprofit organizations, et cetera, to develop and manage small parks, pocket parks, whatever you want to call them? Is that through more community engagement, ownership, lower costs?
I'm gonna bounce that question to the Center for City Park Excellence at the Trust for Public Land. I think they know all about that, and I do think that there are some innovative things happening with respect to partnerships between green spaces and communities and businesses and so forth, and it's not an expertise of mine, but I do know who I would call, and that's the Center for City Park Excellence. They've got some really good stuff on their website too.
Just reading out a few comments on the how to unscrew the world. Carol says, every person on this webinar, keep chipping away and educate those who hold office and people in power. Look for collaborations with people who are willing to step up. John says, that's why it's so important to walk the hood and appreciate the beauty, Cade.
Thank you, John.
Robert asks, yes, sorry. Robert asks, this question may be unanswerable, but he thinks about it a lot. We lost what people are calling cute in our vernacular all over the world after World War II. How do we get that back? Do we teach it? It wasn't taught in the old generations. How do we ingrain cute in both design and layout in developers and consumers?
I think we're doing a much better job at placemaking than we were 20 years ago. And although there's still a lot of crappy stuff being built, I think there's more good stuff being built as well. And I actually do think we're making progress on that front.
And Robert, if you want to check out Bernice, Allie, Quinlan, and Jen Acosta's podcast, they're working on a Power of Cute podcast. Very soon they'll be launching it. So
great name, good trademark.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for all of your questions, for being so engaged. Thank you to Cade for your wonderful presentation, and